Of course, a cameraman's #1 job is to be able to shoot things properly. It doesn't get any more basic than that.
Super Mario 64 is widely considered to be one of the most influential games in history for a number of reasons. From the fluidity of its controls to such a degree that it still feels good to play even over a generation later, to the creative level design that gradually introduces new gameplay elements rather than dumping them all on the player at once, to how the game rewards exploration in a way that most modern titles seem to have forgotten. But I think the most important element of Super Mario 64 that's often overlooked in discussion is its camera. Don't get me wrong, it has its problems, but it also served as, quite literally, the template for 3D design from 1996 onward, and we're still seeing its influence today. But I'm not going to talk about any of that. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about Mario 64. Instead, I'm going to talk about the artistic potential of a concept it introduced that we almost collectively seem to ignore. This guy. Or rather, what his role is in games. What I mean is that as far as I can tell, Super Mario 64 is the first game to contextualize its camera within the narrative. And whether or not the player is consciously thinking about it, the fact that the camera is built into the narrative can influence not only how the player sees the game's world, but also how they play. Before we get to the potential of the contextual camera, however, we need to discuss what it actually does, and I think the best place to do that is with a rather polarizing game.
You'll have to do better than that, you little shit!
In August of 2010, Kane and Lynch 2 Dog Days released to mostly negative reviews, marking it down for its repetitive gameplay, short runtime, wonky AI, and of course the visually striking but sometimes perplexing contextual camera. And while most of these criticisms are fair, I don't think Kane and Lynch 2 gets nearly enough credit for what it tried and largely succeeded to do. Because the question with the contextual camera is whether it enhances the experience, and if so, how and to what extent. And in that regard, I think Kane and Lynch 2 is absolutely brilliant, because the way the game is presented provides context for almost every other element in the game. The narrative, for example, though I hesitate to call it a narrative because it doesn't have such grand designs, is a high-octane romp through the streets of Shanghai, beginning with a simple act of coercion that quickly goes south and spirals into a gang war, with betrayals happening left and right and culminating in a mad dash to get out of the country. The blistering pace, lack of real storytelling, and of course the impressive consistency of the contextual camera all evoke the unscripted, raw, uncut feeling of a show like Cops, where you genuinely don't know what's going to happen next. And largely due to the camera, Kane and Lynch 2 feels a good deal more realistic than your standard third-person shooter, with a clear 3-act structure, emphasis on set pieces, fairly egregious environmental triggers, and so on. The problem with Kane and Lynch 2, however, is that it's a game, and an aesthetic can't carry a game. The contextual camera in Kane and Lynch 2 is utilized in much the same way that it's used in films. It serves as an anchor of sorts for what's being filmed, making the rest of what's happening on screen make sense. And while Kane and Lynch 2 pulls off this anchor effect in a way that most films that try the contextual camera ought to be envious of, it does virtually nothing to enhance the gameplay, and at times actively interferes with it. Chasing after a target can be a thoroughly unpleasant experience, and largely due to the camera, it's remarkably difficult to fight back when you get shot down. Add to that the wildly inaccurate guns that feel like toys, the cover system that works about half the time and other times works too well, as well as the criticisms leveled earlier, and you have what can be a pretty frustrating experience. That said, however, there's absolutely no question that the diegetically contextualized camera adds something to Kane and Lynch 2. It may not always be pleasant, but the effect on the player's experience is undeniable. Beyond the anchor effect, however, the contextual camera does have another application in games specifically, which is best illustrated in a game quite far removed from Kane and Lynch.
Head to the go-go, baby!
Viewtiful Joe is without a doubt one of the best examples I've found of the contextual camera in games. While it uses the anchor effect of the diegetic camera in much the same way that Kane and Lynch 2 does, what makes Viewtiful Joe unique is that the camera contextualizes not only the story and the world, but the gameplay as well. The presence of the camera makes the abilities, for example, slowing down, speeding up time, and zooming, all make sense, because the game is supposed to be a film, and these things can happen in a film. The camera also maintains a constant presence throughout the game, with the nifty film reel borders when you use one of the powers, and during cutscenes, as well as more subtle effects like film grain when you're regular Joe. Add to that the cheering audience you hear when finishing stages, as well as the
"Just go for it!"
girl, who is much louder than anything else in the soundscape, both giving you the impression that there are people watching this film with you, and you have a collection of elements that not only make the world feel whole and consistent in much the same way that it does in Kane and Lynch 2, but by contextualizing the actual gameplay as a thing happening on screen. However, Beautiful Joe also does something with the contextual camera that only games can do. It enhances the performance aspect of play, where you don't want to just keep doing the same 3 moves over and over. You want to experiment with the entire repertoire of moves, pull off sick combos, and most importantly, look as cool as possible while doing it. In short, to perform. Playing a video game generally isn't thought of as a performance. In terms of capital A art, like that of theater, music, or dance, it's because the player, alone in their living room, lacks an audience to interpret any expression conveyed through his or her play. So, even if the player is straight up killing it, it's still not a performance, because there's no one around to make sense of just how much he's killing it without playing at an arcade or on Twitch or something. And this is where the diegetically contextualized camera in games specifically can be really interesting, because it makes the player into not only a player playing the game, but simultaneously an audience member seeing the game through that camera. In most performances, again, dance, theater, music, the actual player is limited to one role at a time, either spectator or player. But I don't think this is the case in a game like Beautiful Joe, where the diegetically contextualized camera works to subtly bridge that gap, giving the player the motivation to perform, and also making that performance enjoyable. One genre I think could really benefit from what the contextual camera does in terms of motivation and expression for the player is third-person action games. Maybe not the Souls games perhaps, but in something with a more modern setting, like God Hand, Vanquish, The Wonderful 101, Nier Automata, or Devil May Cry, I think it would fit perfectly. Basically the rest of the Platinum/Hideki Kamiya catalog. Devil May Cry especially, in which the entire combat system revolves around showing off and being as stylish as possible. There's even a style meter for crying out loud. Not to mention, of course, that Dante as a character is a cocky show-off who loves to fight. Surely he, and subsequently the player, would be motivated to show off even more for an audience. The contextual camera can also provide context for other common elements of action games like ranking systems. For a lot of players, these rankings are the motivation to perform and do well at the game, but my issue with them is that they're often completely disconnected from the game's world. The Wonderful 101 does this better, with the rankings appearing on newspapers giving you the impression that people are paying attention to you, but in most games it's remarkably out of place. Even in Beautiful Joe, where you're getting beautiful rankings long before Joe decides on his name. The contextual camera can provide answers for questions like what exactly is grading you, questions that, if left unanswered, make the game seem very cold, mechanical, and kind of depressing when you think about it. To contextualize the ranking by means of an audience responding to the way the player plays, however, so that if you're spamming the same 3 moves over and over again, the people watching think you're lame, for example, is much more concrete and a bit more personal, once again channeling that element of motivation, which is where I think the real potential of the contextual camera lies. All of that said though, a diegetically contextualized camera isn't something that every game should concern itself with. It largely depends on the kind of story being told and what type of camera will work within that context. First-person games, for example, get around acknowledging the camera by having your character's eyes serve as the camera, and there's no further explanation needed. 3D fighting games, on the other hand, require a full view of both combatants at all times, and the rapid shifts along the axes that sometimes occur simply couldn't make sense diegetically. And that's fine, because the contextual camera isn't the be-all end-all of camera work in games. This medium is still very much in its infancy. At this early stage in films, it took Orson Welles' Citizen Kane to show us that the camera was more than just a framing device. It had its own grammar and style that could communicate much more than dialogue or special effects could. Video games can capitalize on this same concept. There are very few games out there that make use of even remotely interesting cinematography or cinematic techniques. Most of the time it's a by-the-numbers, over-the-shoulder shot-reverse shot, and that's a real shame. I think the camera is something we at least ought to consider as the medium moves forward, because innovation and pushing the envelope in games doesn't necessarily have to come from a profoundly unique series of events and conflicts or a radical new way of translating a button press. It can come from something as simple as changing the perspective. If you like what you've seen, be sure to subscribe for more videos, as well as another full-length series coming up when it's done. Until then, you could check out the first series I've done on most of Fire Emblem, or perhaps take a look at why I think Ragnarok Online is still important.